Chapter 13 From Gathering to Growing Food. Nenuo's lunch. Nenuo was eating her favorite food, boiled rice, squash, pumpkins, beans and meat. Her grandmother had grown the squash, pumpkin and beans in the little garden plot at the back of her house. She remembered the food had been so different when she had been to Madhya Pradesh as part of a school trip. It was hot and spicy. Why was that so? Varieties of foods today. Most of our food such as fruit, vegetables, grain, milk and meat comes from plants that are grown and animals that are reared. Different plants grow in different conditions. Rice, for example, requires more water than wheat and barley. This explains why farmers grow some crops in some areas and not in other areas. Different animals too prefer different environments. For instance, sheep and goat can survive more easily than cattle in dry, hilly environments. But, as you saw in chapter though, women and men did not always produce their own food. The beginnings of farming and herding we have seen in chapter though that the climate of the world was changing, and so were plants and animals that people used as food. Men, women and children probably observed several things: the places where edible plants were found, how seeds broke off stalks, fell on the ground, and new plants sprouted from them. Perhaps they began looking after plants, protecting them from birds and animals so that they could grow and these seeds could ripen. In this way people became farmers. Women, men and children could also attract and then tame animals by leaving food for them near their shelters. The first animal to be tamed was the wild ancestor of the dog. Later, people encouraged animals that were relatively gentle to come near the camps where they lived. These animals such as sheep, goat, cattle and also the pig lived in herds, and most of them ate grass. Often, people protected these animals from attacks by other wild animals. This is how they became herders. Can you think of any reasons why the dog was perhaps the first animal to be tamed? Domestication is the name given to the process in which people grow plants and look after animals. Very often, plants and animals that are tended by people become different from wild plants and animals. This is because people select plants and animals for domestication. For example, they select those plants and animals that are not prone to disease. They also select plants that yield large-size grain and have strong stalks, capable of bearing the weight of the ripe grain. Seeds from selected plants are preserved and sown to ensure that new plants and seeds will have the same qualities. Amongst animals, those that are relatively gentle are selected for breeding. As a result, gradually, domesticated animals and plants become different from wild animals and plants. For example, the teeth and horns of wild animals are usually much larger than those of domesticated animals. Look at these two sets of teeth. Which do you think belongs to a wild pig and which to a domesticated one? Domestication was a gradual process that took place in many parts of the world. It began about 12,000 years ago. Virtually all the plant and animal produce that we use as food today is a result of domestication. Some of the earliest plants to be domesticated were wheat and barley. The earliest domesticated animals include sheep and goat. A new way of life: if you plant a seed, you will notice that it takes some time to grow. This may be for several days, weeks, months and in some cases years. When people began growing plants, it meant that they had to stay in the same place for a long time looking after the plants, watering, weeding, driving away animals and birds, till the grain ripened. And then, the grain had to be used carefully. As grain had to be stored for both food and seed, people had to think of ways of storing it. In many areas, they began making large clay pots, or wove baskets, or dug pits into the ground. Do you think hunter-gatherers would have made and used pots? Give reasons for your answer. Storing animals multiply naturally. Besides, if they are looked after carefully, they provide milk, which is an important source of food, and meat, whenever required. In other words, animals that are reared can be used as a store of food. Apart from food, what are the other things that could have been obtained from animals? What are animals used for today? Finding out about the first farmers and herders, turn to map though, page 14. You will notice number of blue squares. Each marks a site from where archaeologists have found evidence of early farmers and herders. These are found all over the subcontinent. Some of the most important ones are in the northwest, in present-day Kashmir, and in east and south India. To find out whether these sites were settlements of farmers and herders, scientists study evidence. F. Plants and animal bones. One of the most exciting finds includes remains of burnt grain. These may have been burned accidentally or on purpose. Scientists can identify these grains, and so we know that number of crops were grown in different parts of the subcontinent. They can also identify the bones of different animals. Look at the table below to see where evidence of grain and bones of domesticated animals have been found. Grain and bones sites. Wheat, barley, sheep, goat, cattle Mehergarh, in present-day Pakistan. Rice, fragmentary animal bones Koldeva, in present-day Uttar Pradesh. Rice, cattle, hoof marks on clay surface, Mahagra, in present-day Uttar Pradesh. Wheat and lentil Gufkril, in present-day Kashmir. Wheat and lentil, dog, cattle, sheep, goat, buffalo, Burzahom, in present-day Kashmir. Wheat, green gram, barley, buffalo, ox Charand, in present-day Bihar. Millet, cattle, sheep, goat, pig Halur, in present-day Andhra Pradesh. Black gram, millet, cattle, sheep, pig Payampally, in present-day Andhra Pradesh. These are just some of the sites from which grain and bones have been found. Towards a settled life, archaeologists have found traces of huts or houses at some sites. For instance, in Burzahom, in present-day Kashmir, people built pit houses, which were dug into the ground, with steps leading into them. These may have provided shelter in cold weather. Archaeologists have also found cooking hearths both inside and outside the huts, which suggests that, depending on the weather, people could cook food either indoors or outdoors. Draw a pit house. Stone tools have been found from many sites as well. Many of these are different from the earlier Paleolithic tools, and that is why they are called Neolithic. These include tools that were polished to give a fine cutting edge, and mortars and pestles used for grinding grain and other plant produce. Mortars and pestles are used for grinding grain even today, several thousand years later. At the same time, tools of the Paleolithic types continued to be made and used, and remember, some tools were also made of bone. Many kinds of earthen pots have also been found. These were sometimes decorated and were used for storing things. People began using pots' new stone tools. Compare these with the tools shown on page 13, chapter 2. Can you see any similarities or differences? For cooking food, especially grains like rice, wheat and lentils that now became an important part of the diet. Besides, they began weaving cloth using different kinds of materials, for example cotton, that could now be grown. Did things change everywhere and all at once? Not quite. In many areas, men and women still continued to hunt and gather food, and elsewhere people adopted farming and herding slowly over several thousand years. Besides, in some cases people tried to combine these activities, doing different things during different seasons. What do you think could have been stored in this jar? What about other customs and practices? Archaeology does not tell us directly about these. Scholars have studied the lives of present-day farmers who practice simple agriculture. They have also studied the lives of herders. Many of these farmers and herders live in groups called tribes. Scholars find that they follow certain customs and practices that may have existed earlier as well. Tribes, usually 2 to 3 generations, live together in small settlements or villages. Most families are related to one another, and groups of such families form a tribe. Members of a tribe follow occupations such as hunting, gathering, farming, herding and fishing. Usually, women do most of the agricultural work, including preparing the ground, sowing seeds, looking after the growing plants and harvesting grain. Children often look after plants, driving away animals and birds that might eat them. Women also thresh, husk, and grind grain. Men usually lead large herds of animals in search of pasture. Children often look after small flocks. The cleaning of animals and milking is done by both men and women. Both women and men make pots, baskets, tools and huts. They also take part in singing, dancing and decorating their huts. Some men are regarded as leaders. They may be old and experienced, or young, brave warriors, or priests. Old women are respected for their wisdom and experience. Tribes have rich and unique cultural traditions, including their own language, music, stories, and paintings. They also have their own gods and goddesses. What makes tribes different from many other societies you will be studying about is that land, forests, grasslands, and water are regarded as the wealth of the entire tribe, and everybody shares and uses these together. There are no sharp differences between the rich and the poor. Make a list of all the activities performed by men in tribal societies. What do women do? Are there any activities that are done by both men and women? A closer look. Living and dying in Mehergarh. Find Mehergarh on map 2, page 14. This site is located in a fertile plain, near the Bolan Pass, which is one of the most important routes into Iran. Mehergarh was probably one of the places where women and men learned to grow barley and wheat, and rear sheep and goats for the first time in this area. It is one of the earliest villages that we know about. Archaeologists who excavated the site found evidence of many kinds of animal bones from the earliest levels. These included bones of wild animals such as the deer and pig. In later levels, they found more bones of sheep and goat, and in still later levels, cattle bones are most common, suggesting that this was the animal that was generally kept by the people. Earlier and later levels. When archaeologists are digging at an excavation site, how do they know which level is earlier and which is later? Look at the illustration. Suppose people first start living on flat land, layer char. Over the years, the surface will gradually rise, because people discard waste material and generally stay and rebuild houses in the same place. After hundreds of years, this leads to the formation of a mound. So, when this mound is dug up, what is found from the upper layers of the mound is generally from a later time than what is found from the lower layers of the mound, which are older. These upper and lower layers are often referred to as levels. Look at layers 2 and 3. Which do you think is the earlier level? Other finds at Mehergarh include remains of square or rectangular houses. Each house had 4 or more compartments, some of which may have been used for storage. When people die, their relatives and friends generally pay respect to them. People look after them, perhaps in the belief that there is some form of life after death. Burial is one such arrangement. Several burial sites have been found at Mehergarh. In one instance, the dead person was buried with goats, which were probably meant to serve as food in the next world. A closer look. P. Daujli Heding. Find Daujli Heding on map 2, page 14. This is a site on the hills near the Brahmaputra Valley, close to routes leading into China and Myanmar. Here stone tools, including mortars and pestles, have been found. These indicate that people were probably growing grain and preparing food from it. Other finds include jadeite, stone that may have been brought from China. Also common are finds of tools made of fossil wood, ancient wood that has hardened into stone, and pottery. Elsewhere, find Turkey in your atlas. One of the most famous Neolithic sites, Çatalhöyük, was found in Turkey. Several things were brought from great distances: flint from Syria, cowries from the Red Sea, shells from the Mediterranean Sea, and used in the settlement. Remember, there were no carts. Most things would have been carried on the backs of pack animals such as cattle or by people. What do you think cowries and shells would have been used for? Imagine you are in charge of a small plot of land and have to decide what food crops to grow. What are the plants you would choose? Where would you get the seeds from? How would you plant them? How would you look after your plants? And when would they be ready for harvesting? Chapter 4 in the earliest cities. Saving an old building. Jaspal and Harpreet were playing cricket in the lane outside their home when they noticed the people who were admiring the dilapidated old building that the children called the haunted house. "Look at the architecture," said one of the men. "Have you seen the fine wood carving?" asked one of the women. "We must write to the minister so that she makes arrangements to repair and preserve this beautiful house." Why, they wondered, would anybody be interested in the old, run-down house? The story of Harappa. Very often, old buildings have a story to tell. Nearly 150 years ago, when railway lines were being laid down for the first time in the Punjab, engineers stumbled upon the site of Harappa in present-day Pakistan. To them, it seemed like a mound that was a rich source of ready-made, high-quality bricks. So they carried off thousands of bricks from the walls of the old buildings of the city to build railway lines. Many buildings were completely destroyed. Then, about 80 years ago, archaeologists found the site and realized that this was one of the oldest cities in the subcontinent. As this was the first city to be discovered, all other sites from where similar buildings and other things were found were described as Harappan. These cities developed about 4700 years ago. Very often, old buildings are pulled down to make way for new construction. Do you think it is important to preserve old buildings? What was special about these cities? Many of these cities were divided into 2 or more parts. Usually, the part to the west was smaller but higher. Archaeologists describe this as the citadel. Generally, the part to the east was larger but lower. This is called the lower town. Very often walls of baked brick were built around each part. The bricks were so well baked that they have lasted for thousands of years. The bricks were laid in an interlocking pattern and that made the walls strong. In some cities, special buildings were constructed on the citadel. For example, in Mohenjo-daro, a very special tank, which archaeologists call the Great Bath, was built in this area. This was lined with bricks, coated with plaster, and made watertight with a layer of natural tar. There were steps leading down to it from 2 sides, while there were rooms on all sides. Water was probably brought in from a well and drained out after use. Perhaps important people took a dip in this tank on special occasion. Other cities, such as Kalibangan and Lothal, had fire altars, where sacrifices may have been performed. And some cities like Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and Lothal had elaborate storehouses. Houses, drains and streets generally. Houses were either 1 or 2 stories high, with rooms built around a courtyard. Most houses had a separate bathing area, and some had wells to supply water. Many of these cities had covered drains. Notice how carefully these were laid out, in straight lines. Although you cannot see it, each drain had a gentle slope so that water could flow through it. Very often, drains in houses were connected to those on the streets and smaller drains led into bigger ones. As the drains were covered, inspection holes were provided at intervals to clean them. All 3, houses, drains and streets, were probably planned and built at the same time. List at least 2 differences between the houses described here and those that you studied about in chapter 13. Life in the city, a Harappan city, was very busy place. There were people who planned the construction of special buildings in the city. These were probably the rulers. It is likely that the rulers sent people to distant lands to get metal, precious stones, and other things that they wanted. They may have kept the most valuable objects, such as ornaments of gold and silver, or beautiful beads, for themselves. And there were scribes, people who knew how to write, who helped prepare the seals, and perhaps wrote on other materials that have not survived. Besides, there were men and women, craftspersons, making all kinds of things, either in their own homes or in special workshops. People were traveling to distant lands or returning with raw materials and, perhaps, stories. Many terracotta toys have been found and children must have played with these. Make a list of the people who lived in the city. Were any of these people listed as living in villages such as Mehergarh? New crafts in the city. Let us look at some of the objects that were made and found in Harappan cities. Most of the things that have been found by archaeologists are made of stone, shell and metal, including copper, bronze, gold and silver. Copper and bronze were used to make tools, weapons, ornaments and vessels. Gold and silver were used to make ornaments and vessels. Perhaps the most striking finds are those of beads, weights, and blades. The Harappans also made seals out of stone. These are generally rectangular, see illustration on page 20, and usually have an animal carved on them. The Harappans also made pots with beautiful black designs, such as the one shown on page 6. Was metal used in the villages you learnt about in chapter 13? Was stone used to make weights? Cotton was probably grown at Mehergarh from about 7,000 years ago. Actual pieces of cloth were found attached to the lid of a silver vase and some copper objects at Mohenjo-daro. Archaeologists have also found spindle whorls. Faience, unlike stone or shell, that are found naturally, faience is a material that is artificially produced. A gum was used to shape sand or powdered quartz into an object. The objects were then glazed, resulting in a shiny, glassy surface. The colors of the glaze were usually blue or sea green. Faience was used to make beads, bangles, earrings, and tiny vessels made of terracotta and faience. These were used to spin thread. Many of the things that were produced were probably the work of specialists. A specialist is a person who is trained to do only one kind of work, for example, cutting stone, or polishing beads, or carving seals. Look at the illustration, page 36, and see how well the face is carved and how carefully the beard is shown. This must have been the work of an expert craftsperson. Not everybody could have been a specialist. We do not know whether only men were specialists or only women were specialists. Perhaps some women and men may have been specialists. In search of raw materials are substances that are either found naturally, such as wood, or ores of metals, or produced by farmers or herders. These are then processed to produce finished goods. For example, cotton, produced by farmers, is a raw material that may be processed to make cloth. While some of the raw materials that the Harappans used were available locally, many items such as copper, tin, gold, silver and precious stones had to be brought from distant places. The Harappans probably got copper from present-day Rajasthan, and even from Oman in West Asia. Tin, which was mixed with copper to produce bronze, may have been brought from present-day Afghanistan and Iran. Gold could have come all the way from present-day Karnataka, and precious stones from present-day Gujarat, Iran and Afghanistan. Food for people in these cities. While many people lived in these cities, others living in the countryside grew crops and reared animals. These farmers and herders supplied food to craftspersons, scribes and rulers in the cities. We know from remains of plants that the Harappans grew wheat, barley, pulses, peach, rice, sesame, linseed and mustard. A new tool, the plough, was used to dig the earth for turning the soil and planting seeds. While real ploughs, which were probably made of wood, have not survived, toy models have been found. As this region does not receive heavy rainfall, some form of irrigation may have been used. This means that water was stored and supplied to the fields when the plants were growing. The Harappans reared cattle, sheep, goat and buffalo. Water and pastures were available around settlements. However, in the dry summer months large herds of animals were probably taken to greater distances in search of grass and water. They also collected fruits like bear, caught fish and hunted wild animals like the antelope. A closer look, Harappan towns in Gujarat. The city of Dholavira was located on Khadirpet, also spelled as bed, in the run of Kutch, where there was fresh water and fertile soil. Unlike some of the other Harappan cities, which were divided into two parts, Dholavira was divided into three parts, and each part was surrounded with massive stone walls, with entrances through gateways. There was also a large open area in the settlement, where public ceremonies could be held. Other finds include large letters of the Harappan script that were carved out of white stone and perhaps inlaid in wood. This is a unique find as generally Harappan writing has been found on small objects such as seals. The city of Lothal stood beside a tributary of the Sabarmati, in Gujarat, close to the Gulf of Khambat. It was situated near areas where raw materials such as semi-precious stones were easily available. This was an important center for making objects out of stone, shell and metal. There was also a storehouse in the city. Many seals and sealings, the impression of seals on clay, were found in this storehouse. A building that was found here was probably a workshop for making beads. Pieces of stone, half-made beads, tools for bead making, and finished beads have all been found here. Seals and sealings. Seals may have been used to stamp bags or packets containing goods that were sent from one place to another. After a bag was closed or tied, a layer of wet clay was applied on the knot, and the seal was pressed on it. The impression of the seal is known as a sealing. If the ceiling was intact, one could be sure that the goods had arrived safely. Seals are used even today. Find out what they are used for. The mystery of the end. Around 3900 years ago, we find the beginning of a major change. People stopped living in many of the cities. Writing, seals and weights were no longer used. Raw materials brought from long distances became rare. In Mohenjo-daro, we find that garbage piled up on the streets, the drainage system broke down, and new, less impressive houses were built, even over the streets. Why did all this happen? We are not sure. Some scholars suggest that the rivers dried up. Others suggest that there was deforestation. This could have happened because fuel was required for baking bricks and for smelting copper ores. Besides, grazing by large herds of cattle, sheep and goat may have destroyed the green cover. In some areas there were floods. But none of these reasons can explain the end of all the cities. Flooding or a river drying up would have had an effect in only some areas. It appears as if the rulers lost control. In any case, the effects of the change are quite clear. Sites in Sindh and West Punjab, present-day Pakistan, were abandoned, while many people moved into newer, smaller settlements to the east and the south. New cities emerged about 1400 years later. You will read about them in chapters 6 and 9. Elsewhere, find Egypt in your atlas. Most of Egypt is a dry desert, except for the lands along the river Nile. Around 5000 years ago, kings ruled over Egypt. These kings sent armies to distant lands to get gold, silver, ivory, timber, and precious stones. They also built huge domes, known as pyramids. When they died, the bodies of kings were preserved and buried in these pyramids. These carefully preserved bodies are known as mummies. A large number of objects were also buried with them. These included food and drink, clothes, ornaments, utensils, musical instruments, weapons, and animals. Sometimes even serving men and women were buried with the rulers. These are amongst the most elaborate burials known in world history. Do you think kings would have needed these things after death? Imagine you are traveling with your parents about 4000 years ago from Lothal to Mohenjo-daro. Describe how you would travel, what your parents might carry with them, and what you would see in Mohenjo-daro.